Oh, one other thing. For those of you who have heard my papers in the past, I've got a kind of politics of citation issue where I often, as many of you know, make up citations and also make up authors, or use, if there are people who I don't want to cite, but I want to cite their work, I will change their names. In this case, though, there's a relatively young scholar who's really, as far as I know, really exists, unless she's a large sort of hoax on the world, named Beatrice Fazzi. So it's a real citation. I just want to be really clear, because her work is not super well known, but I think it should be. So yeah, just to be really clear with that. So, Dataphasic inversions. Sometimes I hear in one ear what I should by all rights hear in the other. And it really is the strangest thing. It's more unsettling in many ways than the cognate listening experiences I've shared with tuning spec folks over the years. Experiences of 1,000-foot wide heads, ears in my toes, muddy cochlea, and so forth. The experience of hearing in one ear what I should in the other is more unsettling than these because stereo inversion isn't nearly as consistent a phenomenon as one would expect from its technical iteration. Put your earphones on backwards and the signals are inverted, like black and white, or in this case, like black and red. But it turns out very little of one's listening biome has anything to do with this technical profile of signaletics. Between my ears, there's interposed something that's animated by more occult forces that one can only hear to hear. And these mixtures are, I think, matters of gray importance. As I thought about this further, as I listened longer and more variantly to the ways that the gesture of inversion constitutes a kind of mobile ensnarement of the very tendril channels that it swings about, as I thought about this further, I realized that I really should say that I hear in each ear how I hear in the other, since stereophonic listening is rarely a question of what one hears. A finger snapped next to my right ear is audible in both, but differently so. So the what's in question aren't the objects that are heard, but rather the spacings that are dynamically crafted by the always particular and ongoing hows of intercochlear communication. Rightness and leftness describe textural possibilities, the dynamic relations that listening at once is and affords. Now, if such texturality is obscure in principle, it is mercifully simple in practice. So for example, on one hand, I've learned to look to my right if I should hear a car approaching from the left when I'm crossing a road while in a quasi-inverted state. And this ability took time, it took attention, and I suppose a certain amount of willpower to craft, but it's now a somatic perceptive capacity that I can genuinely claim as my own. But on the other hand, it was only after, for example, having worked on my computer for about 10 minutes at the edge of audibility of my neighbor's lovemaking, that I realized that what I took quasi-consciously to be their tender moanings eloping through the north wall of my apartment was, in fact, the equally tender moanings of my aging cat's dozing snores. I've been duped by the sonic invariance that obtains across different species, different pleasures. And notably, this trickery took place not only without my knowing, but moreover, without my even believing the incorrect provenance. I was only quasi-consciously aware of the sound in the first place. So I didn't know the trick until I knew a truth that could only come about through the trickery. And in any case, I would simply note that unlike the sounds of approaching cars, which I learned to understand, immediately hearing the spatial inversion of such quasi-conscious sounds is, and as far as I can tell, will remain forever beyond my capacity. Now, I was tempted, and we might be tempted, to think that this difference, the difference between being able to train conscious reactions more fulsomely than non- or quasi-conscious ones, we might be tempted to think that this difference evinces something of a depth model of perception. But that's only the case to the extent that the opposite is also true to precisely the same extent. If it were the case that the confused sonic provenance of what I turned out to be my cat's snoring was a result of something buried beneath my consciousness, then there'd be no way to explain my subsequent realization that I was hearing it all along. Instead, the time reversal of the experience, the realization of the fact having been experienced in and as the afterness of the after the fact of experience, the very time reversal suggests that the sensation of depth is produced as a secondary function of the textural differentiation that is the experience of hearing. Again, even if the opposite's also the case. So this differentiation is textural rather than, say, spatial, to my mind, because it relates to qualia rather than causes. And so the designation non-conscious describes a feeling rather than a place. which is why if one bends one's circuits just so, non-consciousness can migrate to consciousness without losing what it is. Psychic time travel is a feeling that we're all hooked on, whether we're high on believing or not. In short, the internal spacing of listening results from the ongoing immanent differentiation of qualia, or put differently, oral qualia communicate in and as the spatialization of their immanent differentiation. And so for me, listening in and to the impossibility of such communication in an inverted stereo field, as happens when I hear in one ear how I hear in the other, listening in this way offers privileged purchase on the impossibility of communication more broadly. So the first thing revealed by stereo non-inversion is that there's something of an impossibility of intercochlear communication that secures the intercochlear relation of binaural listening. And actually, this is in keeping with communicative modalities more generally. I'm a communications theorist. The first rule of which might well be that every communicative modality textures a particular impossibility of communicating. So what's the psyche, for example, if not precisely the disclosure of the impossibility of communication between minds? And indeed, this impossibility may well be taken as the fundamental psychological fact. And likewise, what's information, if not a hardwiring of the literal impossibility of a noiseless transmission? And here again, this impossibility is the fundamental fact of information. And so likewise, the fundamental fact of binaural listening is the impossibility of binaural communication, something like the impossibility of listening. But the point for me in all these cases is that not only are the whats of communication really intimately entangled with the hows, but also that these what-how couplings, these actually existing acts of communication, interact bivalently with their conditions of appearance. This is an aesthetic claim. Scholars have noted for some 2 decades, communication scholars, if the impossibility of communication between minds is the fundamental psychological fact, it's also the fundamental fact of the field of psychology. Right? So these what-how couplings interact bivalently with their conditions of appearance. They condition the conditions that condition them, we could say, if we wanted to. These what-how couplings interact bivalently with their conditions of appearance, such that a failure of communication, insofar as it actually occurs in the world, is also always something of an unknowable, paradoxical excess. The impossibility of fully communicating one's psyche is precisely the disclosure of something psychological that remains outside of psychology. The impossibility of binaural communication, which is to say of listening, is precisely the disclosure of something stereophonic that can't be inverted no matter how one swaps one's earphones. And all of this matters. And believe me, I say that knowing full well that the pleasures of such linguistic inversions are to an extent inseparable from their history of pernicious perversions, particularly in apolitical profile that they've plotted as they plod through their plodding halls of academia's privileged, myself included. But this matters because communication has become something of a master schema of the social, with the alienating forces of late capitalism having become fully naturalized in a fever dream of universal exchangeability that's most robustly envisioned, I think, through the iconography of computation today rather than capital. So of course it matters that the word technology doesn't just mean consumer computing technologies, but it also matters that for many folks, much of the time, it does, myself included. The equation today is simple. For the most part, communication equals computation equals data equals exchangeability. And it matters because this Dadic dream of universal exchangeability continues to circulate long after anyone, really anyone, believed in its communicative alibi. Nobody really believes in data in the pure, non-relational sense of the term that a computational perspective hallucinates. Nobody believes in an idea of information as something that can be communicated, as something that remains unchanged as it moves between contexts. Moreover, nobody believes in the corollary claims that if we only had more information, the universe would be revealed to be fully determinate. And yet, even in the absence of belief per se, even in the absolute acceptance that none of our opinions will ever be changed by facts, even in the absence of belief per se, inherited again from the capitalism to which it also returns, the paradigm of universal, acontextual, informatic exchangeability persists. So we're living in the afterlife of data. We're living in a time when data persists as an impactful element precisely through its repeated and particular failures to actually exist. Now, Beatrice Fazzi's work, again, as far as I know, really existing scholar, brilliant work incisively spells this out by connecting the dominant understanding of computation to Leibniz's concept of a universal conceptual language that could unambiguously represent all that can be thought and expressed, and that could be acted upon according to a general mathematical science. As Fazzi demonstrates, it's, quote, impossible to ignore the influence that this dream of universal symbolic calculation has exerted upon the development of contemporary computing, because it, quote, crafts a generalization of the rules of thought itself that amounts to an attempt to construct a machine of thought. Now, specifically, Leibniz's perspective gives thinking a, quote, inferential, normative, and procedural form that's completed for Fazzi in Turing's algorithmic method, wherein reasoning becomes axiomatic. Reasoning in Turing's thought, and then, of course, in the computers that flow from its legacy, reasoning is, quote, fully automated insofar as it needs nothing but itself in order to prove its validity. Now, crucially for Fazzi, Leibniz's proposed machine of thought and Turing's treatment of thought as if its, quote, behavior was already similar to that of a machine, work together to suture the notion of calculative validity to generality, which is to say, the preclusion of texture. If, quote, calculation is valid reasoning, and if valid reasoning always aims to be universal, then a valid calculative method is one that tries to be as general as possible. That is, quote, the automation of thought thrives on this procedural determinism of rules of inference. It is its complete determination that makes a machine, whether it's a machine of thought or anything else, it's complete determination that makes a machine a machine. So simply put, the computational understanding of thought that Fazzi charts is predicated upon the assumption that, quote, both proof and function can be placed outside somehow of space and time, and even outside of context and content. To be blunt, as communication becomes computational thought, as communication becomes computational, thought is conceived as datic, and datic becomes essential, quite literally. All signals are exchangeable for others. And yet, that's not how I hear things when I hear in one ear as I hear in another, as I should hear in another. Now, of course, there are ample criticisms of this understanding of thought, which inevitably involve abstracting from the spatio-temporal and affective dynamics that are immanent to lived experience. I think we all know this here. As Fazzi concisely summarizes, such processes can, quote, only be reduced to their logical representation by way of the approximation and generalization of those dynamics, which is to say, by robbing them of the very contingent dynamism that defines lived experience. And yet again, it's worth keeping in mind, I think, just how deeply naturalized this perspective has become in the same historical moment during which it has been so comprehensively debunked. Right? So while it's easy enough to find instances, for example, where such deterministic thinking is refused in the name of embodied processes, the logic of generalization nonetheless, to my mind, remains ubiquitous and really tremendously seductive, despite my best intentions. So it's easy enough to say that Facebook, for example, fails to cultivate the level of intimacy that face-to-face conversation affords. But the reasons for this, reasons that we might cite like inter-individual affective exchanges, shared contextual cues, sexuality, smells, etc., these reasons for Facebook's communicative shortcomings remain generally true rather than singularly so. That's what makes them reasons. And so if we listen today, as I believe we do, if we listen today in the afterlife of data, it's worth noting those moments when we hear in one ear how we should hear in the other. And these are worth noting because the excessive disclosures that are thus articulated are made not despite the computational fever dream of universal exchangeability, but in fact through it. When I hear in one ear as I should in the other, this isn't really an inversion, but rather a disclosure of a certain kind of fugue state through which hearing, like any communication, proceeds. A communicative black box arbitrating between my ears, not as a negative space, but rather as a kind of terrarium for the strange excesses that are the stuff of a world that's always more than one. Worlds that are firstly and lastly transductive, incoherent, and yes, occult. So these dataphasic inversions are particular, and particularly so in their unfoldings over time, through which the polyvalence of their excessiveness comes to be known precisely as that which cannot be computed, communicated, or exchanged. or so I've heard. Thanks.